I once read this book, Recarving Rushmore, by libertarian analyst Ivan Eland. In it, he evaluated every president based on 3 criteria. Peace, which he describes as not involving the U.S. in unnecessary foreign wars. Prosperity, which he describes as the adoption of policies that helped grow the economy. And liberty, which he says involves upholding political freedoms and deregulating the economy. Through these 3 metrics, Eland determines the greatest presidents in U.S. history and recarves Mount Rushmore, as the title says, based on his libertarian philosophy. Spoilers, it's Tyler, Cleveland, Van Buren, and Hayes. Read the book for more info, link in the description. That being said, with the presidency of Joe Biden officially over and it seeming unlikely he will be back in 4 years, or even alive, I thought it would be fun to use Eland's metrics to evaluate Joe Biden. We're going to evaluate the presidency of Joe Biden based on his adherence to peace, prosperity, and liberty. Starting with peace, we have to talk about the Russo-Ukrainian war. Of course, Biden doesn't get the entire blame for the Russo-Ukrainian war, but some blame does fall on Biden for attempting to expand NATO to include Ukraine, which Russia says is a key reason why they invaded Ukraine. Even more blame falls on Biden for sending billions to fund this war. There have been other issues, such as approving offensive strikes by Ukraine and not agreeing to sit down and have peace talks, but the one positive is we haven't gotten involved in the ground so much, but we are certainly involved financially and diplomatically in this war, which is a negative. This one feels like it was forever ago, but if you remember, Trump wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan by May of 2021. Biden became president and moved that back to September of 2021. Now, this situation became a chaotic mess, and the Taliban, of course, returned to power. There were a lot of reasons for that, and it was probably going to happen inevitably. Many of the generals have said as much, that there was just no way for the Afghan government we were kind of propping up to maintain any power, but nobody really saw it going as poorly as it did. However, a libertarian analysis would show that even though the situation was chaotic, Biden did end U.S. involvement in the war, and this is a positive from Eland's perspective. So there was chaos, and Biden loses a little bit of points on that, but removing the United States from our longest war ever is certainly a positive of the Biden administration. We also, of course, have to talk about the war between Israel and Hamas. Joe Biden has supported the state of Israel with billions of dollars in funding since the October 7th attacks. He's done this despite the complaints of many in his political party. Joe Biden has consistently pursued ceasefires and releases of hostages to a limited degree of success until fairly recently. One positive for the Biden administration is that they have a limited U.S. involvement on the ground in Israel, and one big negative was Joe Biden had these strikes against the Houthis, which are in the Middle East, and those needed congressional approval, at least according to Eland, and Joe Biden did not get that congressional approval for those strikes. This makes the situation in Israel a little bit of a mixed bag, but certainly less peaceful than when Biden took office. And lastly, to briefly touch on the situation in Yemen, there has been a brutal civil war going on in Yemen for years and years and years. And one of the big criticisms of U.S. foreign policy is that we were selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was turning around and using those arms to commit war crimes in Yemen. Early on into Biden's term, he limited arms sales to Saudi Arabia as a result of this. And then they limited their own involvement in the Yemeni civil war. Joe Biden has supported a truce that has been made in the Yemeni civil war, and overall the situation has gotten a lot less violent and a lot less brutal, and the United States is less involved in that situation, which is a good thing. Moving on to prosperity, and remember that's economic policy, the first thing is the continued federal deficit increases of the Biden administration. Biden and Trump tripled deficits in 2020 and 2021 in response to the pandemic. After 2021, Biden continued the path of deficit increases that had occurred at the end of the Obama administration and gone throughout the Trump administration. Biden added something like $10 trillion total to the national debt. Some hold things like the CHIPS Act, which we will talk about later, and the Inflation Reduction Act as successes, but these were at least part of the issue with the deficit increases. Another issue with Joe Biden's economic policy was that he continued Trump's trade war with China. During the election, he at least gave lip service to free trade, even though he's never been a staunch free trade advocate. And then during his presidency, he kept all of the trade barriers with China that Donald Trump had put into place. Trade barriers are a bad thing, economically speaking. They lead to inflation. They lead to less global economic cooperation. So overall, this only hurts Biden in an Eland libertarian philosophy evaluation. Lastly, we have to talk about inflation. Now, the inflation that we saw in 2022 when it got super high was not solely due to Biden's economic policies. It was also in part due to Trump's economic policies, also in part due to the Federal Reserve, also in part due to Russia invading Ukraine. Inflation is very complicated. Please watch this video if you don't understand it from Professor Dave. But the Biden administration certainly contributed early on with things like the stimulus packages and things like continuing trade wars. Biden did help to secure supply chains, which at least in part helped to bring inflation back down to reasonable levels that we see it at today. Moving finally down to liberty, we of course are talking about personal and political liberty as well as like economic deregulation. We of course have to talk about how Biden handled the pandemic. So we're going to talk about three different things that Biden did because they were varying levels of bad. First was his mask mandate for federal employees. Now this was a bad policy, but if you work for the federal government, you do work for the president, so he kind of has the authority to do this. Then Biden banned travel with dozens of countries, which it's dubious if the president can even do this, and regardless, it's a bad policy and hurts personal liberty. Lastly, in an unprecedented move, Joe Biden attempted to force hundreds of millions of people to get a vaccine through an OSHA mandate, which was very weird legalese, and it of course was blocked by the Supreme Court in a 6-3 decision. However, Joe Biden certainly still gets blamed for trying to take this policy, even if it got shut down by the Supreme Court. Also, side note, Democrats on the court seemingly believe OSHA should have unlimited, unchecked power over all workers, which was kind of a weird thing for them to say. Next up, Biden tried multiple times to forgive massive amounts of student loan debt. Each time it was struck down by courts because the president does not have the authority to do this. The president does not have the power over the money going out. Congress has what we call the power of the purse, which means they get to determine spending or loan forgiveness for that matter. The president can't do this. Now, even though Biden failed at this, it's still him trying to abuse his power, trying to take power that he did not have the ability to take. And so that's still a knock against Biden. Now, another issue with Joe Biden was that he supported ending the filibuster. If you don't know, the filibuster is an important rule that protects the minority party in the Senate. It does this by allowing a senator to continue to speak on a bill, thus stopping a bill. It is very controversial. Somewhat famously, Ted Cruz once used it and read green eggs and ham on the Senate floor.
Do you like green eggs and ham? I do not like them, Sam I am. I do not like green eggs and ham.
Biden expressed support for getting rid of the filibuster despite not doing so during his 36 years in the Senate. The filibuster is important to maintain our protection against a tyranny of the majority, so by supporting ending the filibuster, Joe Biden was once again supporting a policy that would be opposed to liberty. One of the biggest pieces of legislation during the Biden administration was the Chips and Sciences Act. This law invested money to help grow the semiconductor industry in the United States. Now, this law was not revenue neutral, but it did provide tax breaks for companies, and it could potentially be necessary in the future for security because we can't be reliant on other countries for things like semiconductors and microchips. Lastly, Joe Biden helped to get the Respect for Marriage Act passed through both houses with bipartisan support, which we don't see much these days. That law ingrained same-sex and interracial marriage into law. Now, same-sex marriage and interracial marriage had been established by earlier Supreme Court decisions, but as we've seen recently with abortion, Supreme Court decisions can be overturned by different Supreme Courts. Thus, by codifying protections for same-sex marriage and interracial marriage into law, they are better protected and a freedom and a liberty for these groups of people is better established. So in summary, starting with peace, not all situations going on in the world are entirely his fault, but the world is certainly less peaceful than it was before, although he has avoided ground involvement and got us out of Afghanistan, which was good. In terms of prosperity, terrible budgets, terrible trade policies, and inflation show that the Biden administration was not a very prosperous time for the American economy. And in terms of liberty, the way that Biden handled the pandemic and student loans and other situations showed that he was willing to attempt power grabs that he did not have the ability to do, and those overrun minor successes with some other things. Overall, I think Biden would certainly rank in the bottom half of all presidents in each category, with prosperity and liberty being especially bad. Biden probably ranks around the 35 to 40 mark. I would hesitate to put him as the worst president, but I would not hesitate to put him in the bottom 10 presidents. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree.